In the heart of the Roman Empire, where marble palaces lined the forum and senators debated beneath towering columns, marriage was never about love. It wasn't about finding a soulmate or living a life of passion and loyalty. Marriage was a contract or carefully calculated alliance between powerful families, meant to protect assets, secure bloodlines, and strengthen political ties. Romantic feelings were irrelevant. Within this system, infidelity wasn't scandalous, it was expected. Roman husbands took lovers freely, often with no attempt to hide their affairs. These weren't secret dalliances in the shadows. The affairs of noblemen were a known and accepted part of public life. Courtesans, mistresses, and even long-term companions outside marriage were normal. But beyond their liaisons with women, Roman men often engaged in intimate relationships with other men, and this too was considered part of life. To understand Rome's ideas of love, one must let go of modern labels like straight, gay, or bisexual. The Romans didn't think in those terms. What mattered most to them was dominance, who controlled the relationship, not necessarily who it was with. Power was the currency of affection in typical relationships between men and women. The man was dominant, the initiator, the authority. The woman, by contrast, was expected to be submissive. This dominance wasn't just a personal role, it symbolized the man's social power. But in same-sex relationships, the lines became more complicated. When two men were involved, someone had to take the submissive role. For a fully grown man to be seen in that position could invite ridicule or loss of reputation, lest the arrangement followed. Roman norms. One such accepted form was the mentorship-based bond known as pederasty. In these relationships, an older man, called the erastes, would form a connection with a younger boy, the eraminos, often a teenager from an aristocratic family. This was not just a romantic or physical bond, it was also educational, social, and political. The older man provided guidance, resources, and elite training. The younger partner gained mentorship, connections, and access to power. In elite Roman circles, such relationships were viewed as part of a young man's path to adulthood. A well-placed connection with a powerful patron could lead to a career in politics, the military, or administration. The large age gaps did not raise eyebrows. Among Rome's aristocracy, they were expected. To them, this was a system one that preserved tradition and influence. These relationships often walked a thin line between affection and manipulation. But they were central to the social structure of Rome. They were referenced in literature, etched into public monuments, and whispered about in the steam of public baths. In Rome, love, sex, and power were never separate. They moved together, braided into every deal, every household. Every generation of Rome's elite, among Rome's most powerful men, emperors, generals, and senators, it was not only normal, but expected to have both male and female lovers. These relationships didn't challenge their status, they confirmed it. For a man in power, choosing a lover was a reflection of dominance, control, and often protection. In a world without modern birth control, and where childbirth could be fatal, taking male lovers was sometimes seen as a way to avoid risking a wife's life. Strange as it may seem today, same-sex affairs were considered by some a practical solution. In these relationships, the more powerful partner, especially if he was an emperor, was expected to assume the dominant masculine role. It reinforced his image as a ruler in control of all things, even in intimacy. But Rome didn't always follow its own rules. Even the most powerful men could defy expectations. Julius Caesar, Rome's most legendary general and statesman, was a prime example. Despite his conquests on the battlefield and unmatched political mind, rumors swirled that Caesar sometimes preferred the passive role in his same-sex relationships. For a man of his stature, this shocked Roman society. Gossip followed him from taverns to temples. The idea that Rome's most commanding figure might submit in private contradicted everything the elite claimed to value about power and masculinity. Still, Caesar's influence remained untouchable. But he was only the beginning. Decades later, Emperor Hadrian would draw even more attention for the relationship he formed with a beautiful young Greek named Antinous. Though married to a woman for political appearances, Hadrian showed no real interest in his wife. His affections were almost entirely directed at Antinous, a teenager of striking looks and intellect. Hadrian gave him the best education, brought him to imperial ceremonies, and took him along on journeys across the vast empire. Their relationship was no secret. They traveled side by side from Rome to Asia Minor, from the courts of Athens to the temples of Egypt. Wherever Hadrian went, Antinous was with him. But during a voyage down the Nile, tragedy struck. Antinous drowned, under mysterious circumstances that remain unsolved to this day. Whether it was an accident, suicide, or ritual sacrifice, no one knows for certain. Hadrian was devastated. His mourning went beyond grief. It turned into obsession. In an act rarely seen in Roman history, he had Antinous's body mummified and returned to Rome. Near the spot where the boy had died, Hadrian founded a city and named it Antiomopolis in his honor. He minted coins with the young man's face, erected statues across the empire, and even declared Antinous a god. The cult of Antinous spread through Roman provinces from Egypt to Gaul. Shrines were built. Prayers were offered, and his image adorned temples. It was unprecedented. No male concubine had ever been given such reverence. What began as a personal romance transformed into an imperial cult. Hadrian's love for Antinous redefined the boundaries of Roman masculinity. It showed that even emperors, commanders of armies, masters of law could be undone by grief, affection, and the loss of someone who, in the eyes of the empire, should have remained a shadow. While Emperor Hadrian's devotion to Antinous was mournful and poetic, the love life of Emperor Nero was far more chaotic, marked by spectacle, controversy, and scandal. Nero didn't just take male lovers behind closed doors. He turned his personal desires into public theater. In a society where even emperors were expected to maintain the appearance of traditional masculine dominance, Nero deliberately inverted the script in one of his most infamous acts. Nero married a former slave named Pythagoras. The wedding was no symbolic gesture. It was a full Roman ceremony, complete with rituals, guests, and feasting. But Nero played the role of the bride. He wore a veil, he mimicked the behaviors of a Roman woman, and allowed Pythagoras to stand as the groom. For the Roman elite watching this unfold, it was confusing, even absurd. Ember supposedly the embodiment of Roman strength, publicly assuming the submissive role of a wife. It shook the core of Roman expectations. But Nero didn't stop there. Later, he took another young male lover, a boy named Sporus. This time, to appease public opinion, Nero reversed the roles. He positioned himself as the groom and had Sporus presented as a bride, complete with a dress, jewelry, and ceremonial traditions. It was not just a performance of love, but a calculated manipulation of public image. Nero, the emperor, was reminding the people that even in love, appearances mattered. Still, the measures he took to maintain this illusion were brutal. Nero had Sporus castrated, not for affection, but to permanently secure Sporus's place in a feminine role. This act of violence wasn't hidden, it was understood to be part of the show. A way to make the relationship seem legitimate in the eyes of Roman society, which equated physical dominance with social control. Even for Roma culture that tolerated much of what would shock today, this was disturbing. Some citizens whispered in disgust, others mocked. But Nero ruled with such unpredictability that few dared to challenge him openly, and as disturbing as his personal relationships were, they were only part of a larger pattern. Nero's private indulgences often reflected his political recklessness. He blurred the line between stage and state, love and power, submission and spectacle. Unlike Hadrian, who immortalized Antinous out of mourning, Nero transformed his lovers into instrument stools in his elaborate theater of rule. The marriages weren't just acts of affection. They were declarations of control. And in doing so, Nero redefined what it meant to be both a ruler and a man, in Rome frightening some, amusing others. and ultimately adding another layer to his already infamous legacy, while Nero's behavior raised eyebrows. One accusation attached to his name sent an even greater shock through Roman society, one so potent that it echoed through centuries. Ancient historians claim that Nero had engaged in an incestuous relationship with his mother, Agrippina the Younger. The allegation wasn't whispered by common citizens, it was recorded in texts by Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus. According to these accounts, it was Agrippina who initiated the relationship, using seduction as a weapon to control her son after he rose to power. In a city already tolerant of many taboos, incest was one of the few lines that could never be crossed. But was it true? Most modern scholars agree it wasn't. The claim likely emerged from the toxic political climate of the time. Roman elites had a powerful tool when it came to destroying rivals, sexual slander. By accusing someone of violating the deepest taboos, especially a public figure, they could tarnish their name beyond repair. When that someone was an emperor, the accusations only grew more outrageous. Incest wasn't just a rumor, it was a weapon. It painted Nero not just as immoral, but as monstrous. To say he had defiled the very woman who birthed him was to strip him of legitimacy, masculinity, and humanity in one stroke, and this wasn't unique to Nero. In Rome, character assassination often took the form of sexual defamation. Political enemies didn't just argue about laws or governance, they attacked each other's manhood, their private habits, their roles in the bedroom. Being accused of submissiveness, of deviancy, of scandal, these weren't mere insults, they were tools of warfare. What the case of Nero and Agrippina reveals is not just the darkness of imperial rumor, but how powerful and dangerous sexuality was in Roman politics. In a culture obsessed with control and image, what one did behind closed doors could destroy an entire legacy, and yet, for all the fire and drama of the stories, many of them remain unproven, tangled in layers of exaggeration, gossip, and political hatred. But one thing is certain. In Rome, power and sex were never private. They were woven together, played out on stages both public and personal, and used as weapons in battles far beyond the bedroom. If Nero's rule was marked by spectacle, Emperor Tiberius's legacy is remembered in shadows marked by isolation, secrecy, and a much darker brand of indulgence. As he aged, Tiberius withdrew from public life and retreated to the island of Capri, a quiet paradise in the Mediterranean. But what happened on that island would become one of the most disturbing chapters in imperial history. Officially, Tiberius claimed he sought peace, solitude, an escape from the political chaos of Rome. He built luxurious villas on the cliffs of Capri, surrounded himself with art, gardens, and servants. But behind those walls, far from the eyes of the Senate or the city's people, something far more sinister reportedly took place. Ancient sources, especially the historian Suetonius, describe scenes that shock even by Roman standards. Tiberius allegedly surrounded himself with young boys, brought in under the guise of servitude, but used for his personal desires. Some were said to be as young as 10. The emperor kept them as playthings trained to satisfy his every whim in elaborate fountains, pools, and bedchambers. These accounts include accusations of sadism, humiliation, and systematic abuse. The boys were not just servants or lovers. They were victims powerless in the face of the emperor's appetite, kept isolated on an island they could not leave. Tiberius, it's said, gave them nicknames, dressed them in costumes, and treated their trauma as entertainment. Yet even with all the horror in these stories, historians caution against accepting every word. Roman authors, especially those writing after a ruler's death, often exaggerated. They thrived on scandal. Tales of emperors gone mad sold scrolls, turned public opinion, and cemented legacies in infamy. So how much of it is true? We may never know. But even if half of it was, the reality is damning. It reflects a broader truth about Rome at its pecan empire, where absolute power gave men unchecked control over others' bodies, where youth, beauty, and submission were currency, where being a concubine to the wrong man could mean a life of luxury or a lifetime of unspoken torment. Tiberius died in his villa, far from the city he once ruled, leaving behind not just a legacy of conquest and governance, but whispers of boys who never returned from Capri, of an emperor who turned paradise into a prison, and of a world where the lives of young concubines were shaped not by who they were, but by who owned them.